Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Vault. There is a place on this planet that most humans will never see, never touch, and never truly comprehend. A place so far removed from the world we know that it exists in a kind of permanent, pressurized silence, deep beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a darkness that sunlight has never once reached. That place is called the Challenger Deep. It is not simply the deepest point in any one ocean. It is the deepest point in all of Earth's oceans combined. And more than that, it is the single lowest surface elevation on the entire planet. If you were to measure every valley, every canyon, every trench carved into the face of this Earth, nothing goes deeper than this. Nothing even comes close. The Challenger Deep sits within a much larger geological feature known as the Mariana Trench, a vast underwater canyon stretching across the floor of the western Pacific Ocean. The trench is shaped something like a crescent, a long, curving scar in the ocean floor, cutting through some of the most remote waters on Earth, lying east of the Philippines and not far from the island of Guam. The trench itself is enormous. But the Challenger Deep is found specifically at its southern end, where the seafloor drops to its most extreme and extraordinary depth. Its coordinates place it at approximately 11 degrees north latitude and 142 degrees east longitude, a very precise address for a place that feels, in almost every way, like another world entirely. In more familiar terms, this location sits roughly 320 kilometers, about 200 miles, southwest of Guam, out in open ocean, far from shipping lanes and shorelines. The waters above it belong to a region that falls under the territory of the Federated States of Micronesia, a scattering of small island nations spread across the western Pacific. It is, by nearly every measure, one of the most remote and extreme environments on the surface of this planet. And yet it is here, in this quiet and unreachable corner of the Pacific, that the Earth keeps its deepest secret. To understand just how deep the Challenger Deep truly is, you have to let go of the numbers for a moment and think in images. The depth ranges somewhere between 10,935 meters and 10,994 meters. In miles, that is roughly 6.8 to 7 miles straight down. Written out, those numbers are almost too large to feel real. But consider this: if you took Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the surface of the Earth, and lowered it down into the Challenger Deep, the very peak of that mountain would still be submerged beneath more than a mile of ocean water above it. Everest would disappear entirely, swallowed by the deep, with room to spare. That single image, one of the most enormous things humans have ever stood on top of, completely buried, begins to give a sense of the scale involved. And the pressure down there matches that scale in every way. At the surface of the ocean, the atmosphere presses down on us at what scientists call 1 bar of pressure. At the bottom of the Challenger Deep, that pressure reaches approximately 1,086 bar. Over 1,000 times the pressure of our everyday world, pressing in from every direction with a force that would instantly and catastrophically crush any unprotected human body. The weight of all that water above, column after column, mile after mile of ocean, converges at the bottom into something almost unimaginable in its intensity. This extreme depth places the Challenger Deep firmly within what oceanographers call the hadal zone. The hadal zone is defined as any part of the ocean lying below 6,000 meters, and it takes its name from Hades, the ancient Greek word for the underworld. It is a fitting name. The hadal zone is one of the least explored, least understood, and most inhospitable environments anywhere on the planet. Cold, dark, and crushed under pressure that defies ordinary intuition, it is a realm that obeys different rules than the world we live in. And the Challenger Deep does not simply sit at the edge of the hadal zone. It is the deepest expression of it. The furthest point. The absolute bottom. Two of the most fundamental challenges for any living thing trying to survive in the hadal zone are the pressure and the cold. The pressure, as we have just explored, is extraordinary. But the temperature is its own kind of extreme, hovering just a few degrees above freezing, in a darkness where no warmth from the sun has ever penetrated. Any organism that calls this place home must be built, at the most fundamental biological level, to withstand conditions that would be instantly lethal to nearly every other form of life on Earth. Perhaps it is no surprise, then, that so few humans have ever made the journey down to see it directly. The number of people who have descended to the deepest point of the Challenger Deep can be counted on one hand. In contrast, hundreds of people have stood on the summit of Mount Everest. Dozens have traveled to the surface of the moon. But the bottom of the Challenger Deep has received only the rarest, most carefully engineered visits in all of human history. It is, in the truest sense, one of the last places on Earth. And what does it look like down there? For a long time, people imagined the deep ocean floor as something like a flat, featureless plain, a simple void at the bottom of the world. But the reality of the Challenger Deep is more nuanced than that, and in its own quiet way, more interesting. The Challenger Deep is not a single pit. It is not one enormous hole dropping straight down into darkness. Instead, it is composed of a series of 3 distinct basins, arranged along the floor of a steep underwater valley. 3 separate low points, each one carved into the seafloor, each one occupying its own geography at the bottom of the trench. These 3 basins are referred to simply as the Eastern Basin, the Central Basin, and the Western Basin. Together they form the overall structure of the Challenger Deep, not a single chamber, but a connected series of seafloor depressions, sitting within the walls of the Mariana Trench like 3 bowls resting at the bottom of a canyon. This distinction matters, because it means the Challenger Deep has shape. It has geography. It has a kind of internal landscape that scientists are still working to understand and map with precision. The bottom of the deepest place on Earth is not just an empty darkness, it is a place with its own topography, its own structure, its own quiet and extraordinary form. Picture a valley. Not the kind of valley you might hike through on a quiet afternoon, with sloping green hills and a stream at the bottom, but a valley carved into the floor of the ocean itself, with walls rising steeply on either side and a depth that exceeds anything else on the surface of this Earth. That is the environment in which the Challenger Deep exists. 3 distinct basins, sitting at the base of a steep-walled submarine valley, hidden beneath nearly 11 kilometers of ocean water. And that valley stretches across a considerable distance. The overall axis of the Challenger Deep spans approximately 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles. So while we often think of it as a single point on a map, a single dot at the bottom of the world, it is in reality a landscape. A wide, dark, silent landscape at the bottom of the sea. For a long time in human history, the ocean floor was imagined as something rather simple. A flat, unchanging plain stretching endlessly beneath the waves. It seemed logical enough. After all, the deep ocean was beyond reach, beyond sight, beyond almost any means of investigation. And what we cannot see, we tend to imagine as empty. But as the technology of exploration improved, as ships began lowering instruments into the depths, as sonar began painting pictures of the seafloor, a very different reality emerged. The bottom of the ocean is not flat at all. It is one of the most geologically complex and varied surfaces on the planet. There are vast underwater mountain ranges, stretching for thousands of miles. There are wide abyssal plains, sweeping and quiet. There are volcanic ridges and ancient plateaus. And there are trenches, deep, dramatic gashes in the seafloor, the deepest of which is the Mariana Trench itself. Interestingly, the seafloor in the region directly above the Challenger Deep can appear smoother than you might expect in some surveys, not because it is geologically simple, but partly because the Earth in that region is in a constant state of motion. The crust there is alive in the slow, geological sense of the word. Shifting, adjusting, settling. And that ongoing movement shapes and reshapes the surface in ways that continue to keep scientists busy. Researchers studying this region have approached it methodically, running what are known as east-to-west transects, essentially straight-line surveys crossing the trench from one side to the other, in order to build up a detailed picture of the geology across its width. Each pass of an instrument, each reading, each sonar sweep adds another layer to a portrait of a place that is still, in many respects, less well understood than the surface of the moon. And the reason the Mariana Trench exists at all comes down to one of the most fundamental forces shaping the surface of our planet, the slow, grinding movement of tectonic plates. The Earth's crust is not one solid shell. It is broken into large sections called tectonic plates, and these plates are in constant, if imperceptibly slow, motion. They drift. They collide. They pull apart. And where two plates converge, where one meets another head-on, extraordinary things happen beneath the surface. At the location of the Mariana Trench, two of these great plates are meeting. The Pacific Plate, one of the largest tectonic plates on Earth, is moving slowly toward the Philippine Plate. And because these two plates cannot both occupy the same space, one of them must give way. In this case, it is the Pacific Plate that bends downward, diving beneath the Philippine Plate in a process called subduction. As the Pacific Plate descends into the mantle below, it pulls the ocean floor down with it. And that downward pull, sustained over millions and millions of years, is what has carved the Mariana Trench into the surface of the Earth. The trench is not a crack, exactly. It is more like a long, curved wound in the ocean floor, the scar left behind by one plate of the Earth's crust bending and disappearing beneath another. It is a process that happens slowly, invisibly, on timescales that make human history seem like the briefest flicker. And yet the result, this enormous, crescent-shaped trench stretching across the western Pacific, is one of the most dramatic geological features anywhere on the planet. There is one more layer to the significance of this place that is worth holding in mind. The Mariana Trench, for all its remoteness, for all its depth and darkness and inaccessibility, has not been entirely spared from the reach of human activity. Scientists studying the region have found that it offers a sobering window into how pollutants travel through the ocean system. Even here, at the very bottom of the world, in one of the most isolated environments imaginable, traces of human-made contamination have been detected. The deep ocean, it turns out, is not beyond our reach in that sense. What enters the ocean, whether carried by currents, sinking through the water column over years and decades, can find its way even to the hadal zone. It is a humbling and quietly unsettling discovery. The Challenger Deep is the most extreme, the most remote, the most unreachable place on the surface of this earth. And yet even there, the story of what happens on the surface of our world does not entirely disappear. The ocean floor beneath the Challenger Deep is ancient in a way that is difficult to fully absorb. The Pacific crust in that region dates back to the Jurassic period, somewhere between 200 and 140 million years ago. A time when dinosaurs walked the land above a planet that looked almost nothing like the one we know today. A time before the Atlantic Ocean had fully opened. Before the continents had settled into their familiar shapes. And yet the rock that formed during that distant era is still there, still present, slowly moving, slowly sinking, making the crust near the Mariana Trench among the oldest oceanic crusts still actively being subducted anywhere on Earth. Most oceanic crust gets recycled into the mantle relatively quickly, in geological terms. But this particular section of the Pacific Plate has been traveling, slowly, steadily, over unimaginable stretches of time, toward its eventual descent beneath the Philippine Plate. There is something quietly profound about that. The seafloor beneath one of the most extreme environments on the planet has been in motion since before the age of the great dinosaurs. The trench it is diving into did not yet exist. The ocean above it was a different ocean. And yet here it still is, carrying its ancient mineral memory downward into the earth. The subduction that created the trench is not a finished process. It is still happening. The Pacific Plate is still descending. The trench is still being shaped. And that active geological process has consequences that reach far beyond the seafloor itself, because as one plate grinds beneath another, it generates stress. It generates heat. And it generates earthquakes. Over the past 50 years alone, hundreds of earthquakes ranging in magnitude from 4.5 to 8 have been recorded in the deepest ocean regions associated with the Mariana Trench system. Some of these are relatively modest events, felt only by sensitive instruments. Others reach magnitudes that, if they occurred near a populated coastline, would be considered major seismic events. Down here, they happen in near total isolation, releasing energy into a part of the planet that has almost no human presence to register them. The rocks and materials brought up from the deepest parts of this system have proven to be extraordinarily valuable to scientists trying to understand what happens to oceanic crust as it is subducted. As the Pacific Plate bends and begins its descent, the rock changes. Pressure transforms it. heat begins to affect it. Water and minerals are squeezed out of it and driven upward into the overlying plate. Studying those changes, reading them in the physical structure and chemical composition of the rocks themselves, gives geologists a window into processes that happen deep inside the earth, invisible and otherwise unreachable. Some of the deepest rock samples ever collected from the entire Mariana Trench system have come from this region. Each sample is a small piece of a story that spans hundreds of millions of years, a record of seafloor formation, of slow oceanic travel, of descent and transformation. They are, in their way, some of the most remarkable geological specimens on Earth. But before any of this science was possible, before there were rock samples, or pressure measurements, or sonar maps, someone had to find the trench in the first place. In the 19th century, the deep ocean was one of the last great unexplored territories on Earth. Humans had sailed across the oceans for centuries, had charted the coastlines, had crossed the polar ice. But what lay beneath the water, truly beneath it, in the deepest regions, was almost entirely unknown. There were theories, of course. And there was one theory in particular that held a firm grip on scientific thinking for a long time, the idea that the deep ocean was completely devoid of life. That below a certain depth, nothing could survive. Nothing existed. The deep sea was, in this view, essentially a vast, cold, dead void. This was known as the azoic theory, and for a time it was widely accepted. It took a ship, and a remarkable voyage, to begin dismantling it. In the early 1870s, a British Royal Navy vessel called HMS Challenger set out on what would become one of the most important scientific expeditions in history. Over the course of nearly 4 years, from 1872 to 1876, the Challenger sailed approximately 70,000 nautical miles, stopping at hundreds of locations across the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, and Southern Oceans. At each stop, the crew lowered instruments, collected samples, measured temperatures, and took soundings, dropping weighted lines to measure the depth of the ocean below. It was during this expedition that the Mariana Trench was first identified. One of those soundings, taken in the western Pacific, returned a depth measurement of approximately 8,200 meters. It was an astonishing number for the time, far deeper than anything previously recorded. The true depth of the Challenger Deep, as later and more precise measurements would establish, goes considerably deeper still. But that first measurement was enough to reveal that the ocean floor in that region dropped to extraordinary depths, and that the world beneath the water was far more varied and dramatic than anyone had imagined. And the samples brought up by the Challenger expedition carried another revelation entirely. Life. Life from the deep ocean, organisms collected from depths that, according to the azoic theory, should have contained nothing at all. The evidence was undeniable. The deep sea was not dead. It was inhabited. Strange, adapted, resilient life had found a way to exist in the cold and the dark and the pressure, in places that seemed to offer nothing hospitable at all. The Challenger expedition did not solve the mystery of the deep ocean. In many ways, it simply revealed how deep and how wide the mystery truly was. But it opened a door, and through that door, slowly, over the century and a half that followed, human understanding of the deepest places on Earth has continued to grow. The HMS Challenger returned from its voyage carrying something that would take decades to fully process, not just physically, but intellectually. The sheer volume of what had been discovered was staggering. Among the expedition's findings were approximately 4,700 previously unknown marine species. Animals, organisms, and life forms that science had never recorded, never named, never imagined. Pulled up from the darkness in nets and sample jars, they represented an entirely new dimension of life on Earth. The seafloor samples themselves told their own quiet story. Across vast stretches of the deep ocean, the Challenger's crew found the bottom carpeted in what geologists call Globigerina ooze, a fine, pale sediment composed largely of the microscopic shells of ancient, single-celled organisms that had been raining down from the surface waters for millions of years. In other areas, the sediment gave way to a deep reddish-brown clay, one of the most widespread materials on the deep ocean floor, accumulating so slowly that a layer just a few centimeters thick might represent millions of years of deposition. And scattered across that seafloor, the expedition discovered something else entirely: strange, dark, rounded objects sitting on the sediment, sometimes in great numbers. These were polymetallic nodules, lumpy, potato-sized formations built up over immense periods of time from minerals that slowly precipitate out of the seawater and accumulate, layer by layer, around a tiny fragment of shell or rock. Rich in manganese, iron, nickel, copper, and cobalt, these nodules would eventually become a subject of considerable scientific and commercial interest. But in the 1870s, they were simply one more astonishing thing pulled from a world that no one had known existed. The Challenger expedition gave humanity its first real outline of the ocean floor. But it could only look from above, measuring, sampling, sounding, without ever sending a human being down to see it directly. That would not happen for nearly another century. In January of 1960, two men prepared to do something that had never been done before. Jacques Picard, a Swiss oceanographer, and Don Walsh, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, climbed into a vessel called the Trieste, a deep-diving bathyscaphe, essentially a pressurized sphere suspended beneath a large float filled with gasoline for buoyancy, and began their descent into the Mariana Trench. The journey down took nearly 5 hours. And when the Trieste finally settled onto the seafloor of the Challenger Deep, Picard and Walsh became the first human beings in history to reach the deepest point on Earth. They sat at the bottom of the world, in a small sphere of light and breathable air surrounded by crushing darkness, and looked out through a thick porthole into the deep. They did not stay long. The nature of their vessel, and the demands of a safe return, meant that their time at the bottom was brief, approximately 20 minutes. 20 minutes at a depth that had taken all of human history to reach. But in those 20 minutes, they observed something that added yet another chapter to the story that the Challenger expedition had begun nearly a century earlier. Through the porthole, in the sediment disturbed by their landing, they believed they saw flatfish, a living creature, moving at the very bottom of the Challenger Deep. Life, once again, in a place where life had seemed impossible. That single dive, 20 minutes, 2 men, one small sphere of steel, stood as the only crewed visit to the bottom of the Challenger Deep for more than 50 years. Then, in March of 2012, the film director James Cameron descended alone. Cameron had spent years planning and engineering the expedition, developing a specially built submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger, a vehicle designed not just to survive the journey, but to explore. Where Picard and Walsh had spent 20 minutes, Cameron spent several hours at the bottom, conducting what became known as the Deep Sea Challenge expedition. He collected biological and sediment samples from the seafloor. He documented the environment using high-resolution three-dimensional cameras, capturing footage of the Challenger Deep that no one had ever seen before. He moved across the bottom, observing, recording, reaching into the darkness with instruments and lenses in a way that the brief 1960 descent had not been able to do. The contrast between those two visits, 1960 and 2012, captures something important about how slowly and carefully the deep ocean has given up its secrets. 52 years between the first and second crewed visits to the same location. And the science of studying life in the hadal zone, in those extreme depths below 6,000 meters, only really began in the 1950s. Which means that everything we know about the biology of the deepest ocean has been learned within a single human lifetime. It is one of the youngest branches of science on Earth, exploring one of the oldest and most extreme environments. And what has that science found? What actually lives down there, in the permanent cold and crushing pressure of the Challenger Deep? One of the more surprising answers involves a creature called the amphipod. Amphipods are small crustaceans, shrimp-like animals that are found throughout the world's oceans, usually no more than a centimeter or two in length. Unremarkable, in most settings. Common. Easy to overlook. But the amphipods of the hadal zone are something different. Scientists collecting specimens from the deepest parts of the Mariana Trench have found amphipods of extraordinary size, some reaching lengths of around 17 centimeters, many times larger than their shallow water relatives. In the deep ocean, a phenomenon known as deep-sea gigantism can cause certain species to grow far beyond the sizes seen at the surface. The cold temperatures, the high pressure, the particular conditions of the hadal environment seem, for reasons scientists are still working to fully understand, to favor larger body sizes in some species. These giant amphipods have been found living across a remarkable depth range, from around 6,800 meters all the way down to approximately 11,000 meters, placing them among the deepest living animals ever recorded. They inhabit the very bottom of the Challenger Deep, surviving in conditions that would be instantly lethal to most life on Earth, going about their existence in the darkness with a quiet, unhurried persistence that is, in its own way, one of the most extraordinary things in the natural world. Surviving at the bottom of the Challenger Deep is not simply a matter of being tough. It requires adaptation at every level, from the chemical processes happening inside a cell, to the structure of a body, to the relationship between one organism and another. Take the amphipods. These creatures do not simply endure the hadal zone. In many ways, they appear to be genuinely suited to it, and part of that suitability may come from within. Scientists studying these animals have found evidence suggesting that symbiotic bacteria living inside their digestive systems may play a meaningful role in helping them process food and survive in an environment where nutrients are scarce and conditions are extreme. The amphipod and its internal bacteria, in this view, exist in a kind of partnership, each depending on the other in ways that make survival possible where it would otherwise not be. This kind of biological cooperation, life supporting life in the deep, is one of the quieter themes running through hadal science. Other creatures in the Mariana Trench have found different solutions to the physical demands of living under immense pressure. Some deep-sea crustaceans found in these waters have been discovered to use aluminium, alongside calcium, to reinforce their exoskeletons. This is unusual. In the surface world, calcium is the standard building material for shells and hard structures in marine animals. But aluminium, far more abundant in certain deep-sea sediments, appears to offer structural advantages at extreme depths, and some animals have evolved to incorporate it into their bodies in a way that has no real equivalent in the shallower ocean. It is the kind of biological detail that sounds almost industrial, and yet it is entirely natural, a quiet evolutionary innovation, shaped over generations by the specific demands of one of the harshest places on Earth. Not all deep-sea animals, however, trend toward hardness. In fact, quite the opposite is true for many hadal organisms. The extreme pressure at those depths makes it energetically costly, and in some cases structurally difficult, to maintain the kinds of hard shells and rigid structures that are common in shallower waters. As a result, many animals in the hadal zone have softer, more pliable bodies, more organic in their construction, more yielding. Less shell, more flesh. It is as if the deep ocean demands a certain gentleness of form from the creatures that live there, even as the environment itself is anything but gentle. Among the most striking inhabitants of the Challenger Deep are organisms called xenophyophores. In terms of biological classification, they are protists, single-celled organisms. But they are single-celled organisms on a scale that defies easy intuition. Xenophyophores are among the largest individual cells known to exist anywhere on Earth. They can grow to sizes comparable to a saucer, wide, flat, intricate structures that look, at first glance, more like some kind of soft coral or unusual sponge than anything one might imagine when picturing a single cell. They have been found in abundance in the Challenger Deep, including some of the largest specimens ever recorded. Adapted specifically to extreme depths, they appear to thrive in conditions that are inhospitable to most other forms of complex life. Their biology is still not fully understood, and studying them presents obvious challenges. But their presence in such numbers at the very bottom of the ocean is a reminder that life, given enough time and enough pressure to adapt, finds solutions that no textbook could have anticipated. Then there are the sea cucumbers. Soft-bodied, slow-moving animals that spend their lives crawling across the seafloor, feeding on the fine layer of organic sediment that drifts down from the waters above. In the shallow ocean, sea cucumbers are common and unremarkable. In the hadal zone, they become something rather more interesting. A gray, crayon-shaped sea cucumber has been filmed moving across the seafloor at a depth of nearly 7 miles, placing it among the deepest filmed animals in the Challenger Deep. Unhurried, patient, apparently untroubled by the pressure and cold surrounding it, it moves through the darkness with a kind of quiet indifference to the extremity of its environment. Some of the sea cucumber specimens collected from trench areas nearby may represent species entirely new to science, animals that have never been formally described or named, living out their lives in the deep without any awareness of the human curiosity they have begun to attract. But of all the life found in the hadal zone, perhaps none has captured scientific imagination quite as much as the discovery that vertebrates, animals with backbones, animals belonging to the same broad category as fish, amphibians, birds, and mammals, can survive there at all. For a long time, it was unclear whether the hadal zone was simply too extreme for vertebrate life. The structural demands of surviving that pressure, the metabolic challenges, the scarcity of food, all of it seemed to stack the odds firmly against any fish making a life in the deepest parts of the ocean. Then came the snailfish. Hadal snailfish, members of the family Leparidae, have now been observed and recorded in the Mariana Trench, demonstrating conclusively that vertebrate life is possible in the hadal zone. They are translucent, soft-bodied fish, somewhat tadpole-shaped, that have adapted over evolutionary time to the specific conditions of extreme depth in ways that continue to fascinate biologists. Their cell membranes, their proteins, their entire biochemistry has been shaped by the pressure around them, tuned, at the molecular level, to function in conditions that would denature the proteins and destroy the cell structures of a typical fish within seconds. The Mariana snailfish holds the record as the deepest confirmed fish species ever recorded from the ocean floor. It has been observed at depths exceeding 8,000 meters, with one notable sighting recorded at 8,178 meters, a depth so extreme that it sits well within the hadal zone and within the broader Mariana Trench system, not far above the deepest basins of the Challenger Deep itself. A vertebrate. A fish. Living at 8 kilometers below the surface of the ocean, in cold and darkness and pressure, going about its life as if the extremity of its environment were simply ordinary. Because for the Mariana snailfish, it is ordinary. It is the only world it has ever known. The record for the deepest fish ever observed has shifted more than once, and each new discovery has pushed the boundary of what scientists believed possible for vertebrate life. On one expedition, cameras captured footage of a snailfish moving through the water at a depth of 8,143 meters, at the time, the deepest any fish had ever been filmed. It was an animal that had not been seen before, a species unknown to science, going about its existence at a depth that had until very recently been considered beyond the reach of fish entirely. The footage was extraordinary not because it was dramatic. The fish moved slowly, calmly, the way deep-sea animals tend to, but because of what its mere presence meant. The boundary had moved again. And it has moved since. A more recent report from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration confirmed a fish sighting at 8,336 meters, pushing the record deeper still. Each time researchers return to the hadal zone with better equipment and more sophisticated cameras, the picture of what lives there grows more detailed and more surprising. The fish that inhabit these depths are not simply ordinary fish that have wandered too far down and somehow survived. They are profoundly changed by their environment, shaped by millions of years of evolution into animals that are, at the biological level, fundamentally different from their shallow water relatives. Their skeletons are one place where this is visible. Deep-sea fish in the Mariana Trench have developed skeletal structures adapted to manage the crushing pressure around them. Where surface fish have relatively rigid, mineralized bones, some deep-sea species have softer, more flexible skeletal elements, structures that can yield slightly under pressure rather than fracturing. It is an elegant solution, and one that took an enormous amount of evolutionary time to arrive at. At the genetic level, the changes are even more striking. Researchers studying the DNA of fish from the Mariana Trench have found specific genetic mutations that appear to be directly linked to survival under extreme pressure. These are not random variations. They are changes that seem to confer real advantages in the deep, affecting the way proteins fold and function under conditions that would cause the proteins of a typical fish to fail. Evolution, working across deep time, has rewritten parts of the instruction manual for these animals to suit the environment they live in. And pressure is not the only challenge the deep has posed. There is also the question of light, or rather, the complete absence of it. Below a few hundred meters, sunlight does not penetrate. Below 1,000 meters, the ocean is in total, permanent darkness. By the time you reach the hadal zone, light is simply not a feature of the environment in any meaningful sense. For fish living at 8,000 meters, vision as a primary sense offers limited value. So many deep-sea fish have shifted their reliance toward other senses. Lateral line systems, organs that detect pressure changes in water movement, become more important. Chemical sensing, the ability to detect the faint molecular traces left by food or other animals, takes on a greater role. Some species have reduced eyes, or eyes that have been repurposed to detect the faint bioluminescent glows produced by other creatures, rather than ambient light. The sensory world of a hadal fish is built around different inputs than our own, a world of vibration and chemistry and the occasional cold flash of living light in an otherwise absolute darkness. That darkness has also reshaped something subtler, the internal clocks of these animals. Many organisms, including humans, organize their biology around cycles of light and dark, with internal circadian rhythms that regulate sleep, metabolism, hormone production, and dozens of other processes. In the hadal zone, where there is no light cycle at all, those rhythms have been altered in some species. The biological clock has been tuned to a different kind of time, one that is no longer anchored to the rotation of the Earth and the rising and setting of the sun, but to whatever environmental cues the deep ocean offers instead. And in that same darkness, some animals have turned to making their own light. Bioluminescence, the biological production of light through chemical reactions within living tissue, is one of the most widespread and varied phenomena in the deep ocean. It appears in fish, in jellyfish, in squid, in countless other creatures, serving an extraordinary range of purposes. Some animals use it to attract prey, dangling a glowing lure in the darkness to draw curious animals within reach. Others use it to communicate, or to confuse predators, or to recognize potential mates. Light, in the deep ocean, has become a tool, and in the total absence of sunlight, living light has become one of the defining features of deep-sea existence. the genetic story of how these animals came to be in the deep ocean is, in itself, a fascinating and ancient one. A study examining fish across multiple deep-sea species found that those living at depths of 3 kilometers or more share a particular genetic mutation, one associated with improved protein stability under conditions of high pressure and low temperature. The same change, appearing independently across different lineages. A convergent solution, arrived at separately by different evolutionary paths, pointing to the same biological problem and the same molecular answer. The timescales involved are staggering. Research suggests that eels may have first entered the deep sea approximately 100 million years ago, back when the continents were still arranged differently, when the oceans themselves were younger in their current configurations, when the world above the water would have been entirely unrecognizable. Snailfish, by contrast, appear to be relative newcomers to the deep ocean. The evidence suggests they may have moved into deep-sea trenches around 20 million years ago, still an almost incomprehensibly long time from a human perspective, but recent in the deep history of ocean life. In those 20 million years, they have descended to become the deepest living fish on Earth, inhabiting the very bottom of the hadal zone in conditions that remain, in many respects, at the outer edge of what biology makes possible. The story of life in the Challenger Deep is not a simple one. It is layered, ancient, and still being written, one expedition, one genetic study, one careful frame of deep-sea footage at a time. Science, at its best, is willing to be wrong. It builds a model of how the world works, tests it against new evidence, and revises when the evidence demands revision. The deep ocean has provided more than a few of those moments of revision, and in 2025, it offered another one. For years, a leading explanation for how deep-sea fish cope with extreme pressure centered on a molecule called trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO. The idea was relatively elegant. TMAO, which is found naturally in many marine animals, was thought to act as a pressure-stabilizing compound, helping proteins function correctly under the crushing conditions of the deep. And the hypothesis went further, suggesting that TMAO levels in fish would increase progressively with depth, rising in a predictable way as pressure increased, essentially serving as a biochemical depth gauge. It was a compelling theory, and it held considerable influence in deep-sea biology for some time. But a 2025 study of fish living below 6,000 meters in the Mariana Trench found no significant increase in TMAO levels with depth. The neat, progressive relationship that the hypothesis predicted was not there. The data did not support it, at least not in the way that had been assumed. It does not mean TMAO plays no role in deep-sea adaptation. The picture is more complicated than a simple either-or. But the study was a reminder that the deep ocean continues to resist easy explanations, and that even well-established ideas must keep returning to the evidence to survive. That willingness to keep asking questions, to keep sampling, sequencing, measuring, has driven a new wave of deep-sea research in recent years. And nowhere has that research been more revealing than in the invisible world of the microbes. When most people think about life in the Challenger Deep, they think about the animals, the snailfish, the amphipods, the sea cucumbers drifting across the seafloor. But beneath and around and through all of that animal life, there is another world entirely, far smaller and far more numerous. A world of microorganisms, bacteria, archaea, and other microbial life that exists in staggering abundance and variety throughout the hadal zone, and whose study has become one of the most active and surprising frontiers in deep-sea science. The Mariana Trench has emerged as one of the most important places on Earth for understanding how microbial life adapts to extreme conditions, specifically to the combination of enormous pressure, near-freezing temperatures, complete darkness, and very limited food supply that defines the hadal environment. These are conditions that would rapidly kill most of the microorganisms found in surface soils or shallow coastal waters. But the microbes of the deep have had millions of years to find solutions, and the solutions they have found are, in many cases, entirely unlike anything seen in the microorganisms we are more familiar with. The scale of recent discoveries in this area is genuinely extraordinary. A major research effort focused on the Mariana Trench region, carried out under what became known as the MARE Project, the Mariana Trench Environment and Ecology Research Project, produced what is described as the first systematic, large-scale examination of life in the hadal zone. It was a monumental undertaking in terms of both scope and data. The project collected 1,194 samples from across the trench region, water, sediment, and biological material gathered from different depths in different locations, and analyzed them to build a dataset of 92 terabasepares of genetic information. 92 terabasepares. The scale of that number reflects just how much biological information is encoded in the microbial life of a single ocean trench. From that analysis, researchers identified 7,564 microbial species living in the Mariana Trench region. 7,500 species of microorganism, in one of the most remote and extreme environments on the planet. That alone would be a remarkable finding. But the detail that gives it its full weight is this: approximately 89.4% of those species, nearly 9 out of every 10, had never been reported before in any scientific database anywhere in the world. Previously unknown. Unrecorded. Unnamed. Living in the darkness of the hadal zone, going about their microscopic existence, entirely unknown to science until researchers with the right tools finally went looking. More than 7,500 newly identified microbial genomes, added to human knowledge in a single research effort. It is one of the largest single expansions of known microbial diversity from any one environment in recent scientific history. And it comes not from some newly discovered exotic location, but from a place that has been known to science since the 19th century, the Mariana Trench, sitting in the Western Pacific, studied and sampled and discussed for over 150 years. The fact that we could still be finding this much that is new, this recently, in this place, says something important. It says that the deep ocean is not simply a remote environment, it is a genuinely unexplored one. The difference matters. Remote means far away. Unexplored means unknown. The Mariana Trench, for all the attention it has received, for all the expeditions and measurements and famous dives, remains, at the level of its microbial life, a largely uncharted territory. What these microbes are doing down there, how they obtain energy, how their cellular machinery functions under pressure, what chemical processes they carry out in the sediment and the water column, is a set of questions that researchers are only beginning to answer. Some appear to break down organic material that sinks down from the surface ocean, playing a role in the broader cycling of carbon through the Earth system. Others may derive energy from chemical reactions between minerals and water, in a process called chemolithotrophy, essentially eating rock, in a very loose sense, without any dependence on sunlight or organic carbon at all. The MARE project did not just expand the catalog of known microbial species. It established a foundation, a baseline of what lives in the hadal zone and roughly where, against which future research can be measured. It was, in the words the researchers themselves used, the first systematic large-scale look at hadal life. Not just a sampling here and a sampling there, but a deliberate, comprehensive attempt to map the living world of the deep. And what that map is beginning to show is a world of far greater complexity, diversity, and biological novelty than anyone had fully anticipated, waiting in the dark, patiently, for the instruments and the curiosity to finally arrive. The 92 terabases of sequencing data produced by the MARE project is a number that deserves a moment of appreciation, even if the scale of it is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. 1 terabase is 1 trillion individual letters of genetic code. 92 of them, assembled from 1,194 samples gathered across one of the most extreme environments on Earth. It is not just the largest hadal microbial dataset ever assembled, it is, by the measures researchers use to assess these things, the most comprehensive as well. The MARE project has been described as the world's largest and most complete hadal microbial metagenome dataset, and the findings it has produced are still, in many respects, being absorbed and interpreted by the scientific community. The analysis of material on that scale was only made possible through a combination of advanced sequencing technology and automation, the kind of high-throughput laboratory infrastructure that can process vast quantities of genetic material systematically, rather than one sample at a time. Without those tools, a dataset of this size would have taken not years but decades to produce. The technology, in a real sense, unlocked the biology. And what the biology revealed was a picture of remarkable uniqueness. When researchers compared the microbial species identified in the MARE dataset against global databases of deep-sea microbial life, collections of genetic data gathered from deep ocean environments all around the world, they found very little overlap. The microbes of the Mariana Trench were not simply a regional variant of a broadly shared deep-sea community. They were, to a striking degree, their own thing. Distinct. Separate. A biological world that does not have close equivalents elsewhere in the deep ocean, at least not based on what has been documented so far. That finding carries real significance. It suggests that the Mariana Trench is not just an extreme version of the general deep ocean. It is a genuinely distinct ecosystem, one with its own biological character, shaped by its own specific conditions, home to life that has evolved in response to a particular set of pressures and constraints that are not replicated anywhere else on Earth. Part of what makes the trench so biologically distinctive is its physical structure. The Mariana Trench is not a simple, uniform environment. It has strong topographical variation, changes in depth, and slope, and the nature of the seafloor that vary considerably across its length and width. The three basins of the Challenger Deep alone represent meaningfully different microenvironments. And across the broader trench system, different sections offer different conditions, different sediment types, different pressure regimes, different patterns of organic material deposition from above. That physical variation, researchers have found, plays a direct role in shaping microbial diversity. The landscape of the trench, its hills and walls and basins, its varying depths and substrates, creates a mosaic of different habitats, and different habitats select for different microorganisms. The topography is not just a backdrop. It is an active force in organizing the living world of the deep. And the word selection is important here, because it points to one of the more conceptually interesting findings to emerge from recent hadal microbial research. In ecology, there has long been a debate about the relative roles of two forces in shaping communities of organisms. The first is environmental selection, the process by which specific conditions favor certain organisms over others, filtering a community toward the species best suited to the local environment. The second is random drift, the idea that chance events, independent of any particular fitness advantage, can determine which species end up where. In many ecosystems, both forces operate simultaneously, and disentangling their relative contributions is genuinely difficult. But in the Mariana Trench, the evidence points clearly in one direction. Researchers studying the microbial communities of the hadal zone have found that environmental selection plays a substantially larger role than random drift in determining which microbes live where. The extreme and specific conditions of the trench, the pressure, the temperature, the chemistry of the sediment, the scarcity of food, act as powerful filters, strongly favoring organisms with particular biological capabilities and excluding those without them. This makes intuitive sense, in a way. When an environment is as extreme and as specific as the hadal zone, the margin for error is narrow. The conditions are not merely challenging, they are precise in their demands. An organism without the right pressure-adapted proteins, without the right membrane chemistry, without the right metabolic toolkit, cannot survive there. The environment is doing the selecting, and it is doing it firmly. What emerges, then, is not a random assembly of whatever microbes happen to drift down from above. It is a community that has been shaped, sculpted, in a sense, by the specific and uncompromising demands of one of the most extreme places on Earth. Within that shaped community, researchers have begun to identify broad patterns in how the microbes themselves are built. Looking at the deepest sediments in the trench, scientists have found what appear to be two broad adaptive strategies among the microbial life there. Some organisms seem to be built for efficiency, streamlined genomes, stripped down to the essentials, doing more with less in an environment where energy is scarce and every metabolic investment needs to pay off. These are organisms that have, over evolutionary time, shed the biological machinery they do not need and retained only what is necessary for survival in a specific, stable set of conditions. Others appear to be built for versatility, equipped with a broader range of metabolic capabilities, able to respond to changing conditions, to exploit different food sources as they become available, to shift their biological strategy in response to what the environment offers at any given moment. Where the streamlined organisms are specialists, these are generalists, resilient in a different way, through adaptability rather than efficiency. Both strategies work. Both have found expression in the microbial world of the Challenger Deep. And the coexistence of these two approaches, the lean and the flexible, the specialist and the generalist, within the same extreme environment is itself a reflection of the biological complexity that continues to surprise researchers the more closely they look. The deep is not simple. It never was. It just took a very long time, and a very large dataset, to begin showing us how complicated it truly is. The two broad strategies researchers have identified among hadal microbes, the streamlined specialists and the more versatile generalists, are not the only remarkable things living in the deepest sediments of the Challenger Deep. The more closely scientists look at what is actually happening in the microbial world down there, the more complex and unexpected the picture becomes. At depths of around 10,400 to 10,500 meters, within the deepest basins of the Challenger Deep itself, researchers have found bacteria capable of consuming hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are organic compounds built from hydrogen and carbon, and they include many of the substances we associate with oil and petroleum. Finding bacteria that feed on them at the very bottom of the ocean raises fascinating questions about how these compounds reach the hadal zone in the first place, and what role these organisms play in processing them once they arrive. It is a finding with implications not just for deep-sea biology, but for understanding how organic material moves through the ocean system as a whole. Other trench microbes have been found capable of breaking down carbon monoxide, a molecule that most life forms cannot use as an energy source at all. Carbon monoxide is toxic to many organisms, including humans, precisely because of how it interferes with basic cellular chemistry. And yet there are bacteria in the Mariana Trench that have evolved the machinery to consume it, extracting energy from a substance that, to most of the living world, is simply a poison. It is another example of the deep ocean's consistent habit of rewriting assumptions about the limits of biology. What is particularly striking about the microbial communities of the hadal zone, when researchers examine how they are organized, is how stable their internal networks appear to be. Across the different depth gradients of the trench, from the upper hadal zone down to the deepest sediments, the overall structure of microbial community networks remains relatively consistent. This is not what you might expect in an environment with such extreme variation in pressure and temperature across its depth range. But the network holds together, suggesting that the relationships between different microbial species, who consumes what, who produces what, who depends on whom, have been organized into a resilient architecture over a very long time. Within those networks, certain organisms play disproportionately important roles. Researchers have identified what they describe as hub species and gatekeeper microbes, organisms whose removal or disruption would have outsized effects on the stability of the broader community. They are, in a sense, the keystones of the hadal microbial world. Not necessarily the most numerous, or the most visually prominent, but the most structurally essential. Their presence holds the network together in ways that the majority of species in the community do not. The significance of all this reaches well beyond the boundaries of deep-sea biology. The hadal zone, and the Mariana Trench in particular, has come to be recognized as an important piece in the much larger puzzle of the global carbon cycle. Carbon moves through the Earth system in an enormous, interconnected loop, through the atmosphere, through the surface ocean, through living things, through sediment, through geological processes deep within the Earth. The deep ocean is a critical part of that cycle, acting as both a sink for carbon that sinks from the surface and a site of microbial processing that transforms that carbon into different forms. Understanding how carbon behaves in the hadal zone, how quickly it is broken down, what it is converted into, how much of it is permanently buried in the sediment versus returned to the water column, has implications for understanding the carbon cycle at a planetary scale. The Challenger Deep is not just a curiosity of geography. It is a working part of the Earth's chemistry. And in certain areas associated with the broader trench system, researchers have also found chemical seep environments, places where fluids rich in minerals and chemical energy percolate up through the seafloor. These seeps support their own distinct communities of life, independent of sunlight, powered entirely by chemical energy from within the Earth. They are among the environments most often discussed in the context of the origin of life, because they demonstrate that life does not need sunlight to exist, only chemical gradients in liquid water. The implications for questions about where life began on Earth, and whether life might exist elsewhere in the solar system in environments similarly isolated from sunlight, are considerable. But even as science continues to reveal the extraordinary complexity and importance of the hadal zone, another story has been unfolding alongside it. A quieter story, and in some ways a more troubling one. When researchers began sending cameras and collection devices to the deepest parts of the Mariana Trench, they expected to find life. They expected to find geology. They expected to find chemistry and pressure and cold. What some of them did not expect to find, what none of us should have to find at the bottom of the deepest place on Earth, was a plastic bag. And yet there it was. A plastic bag, resting on the seafloor of the Challenger Deep. Along with candy wrappers, and other fragments of human-made material, photographed and documented at extreme depth by instruments that had traveled kilometers through the ocean to reach them. Objects that had been manufactured at the surface of the world, used briefly, discarded, and somehow made their way, carried by currents, sinking slowly through the water column over months or years, to the very bottom of the Earth's oceans. The plastic bag in the Challenger Deep has become something of a symbol. A single, specific, almost unbearably mundane object in one of the most remote places on the planet, that captures something essential about the reach of human activity across the natural world. And it is not alone. When scientists analyzed sediment samples from the Mariana Trench, including samples taken from the deepest point, they found microplastics in every single one. Not some of the samples. Every sample. Tiny fragments of plastic, invisible to the naked eye, distributed through the sediment of the hadal zone from the upper trench all the way down to the Challenger Deep. There is no sample from the deepest place on Earth that does not contain them. The deep ocean, it turns out, is not beyond our reach. It absorbs what we put into the surface world. It accumulates it. It buries it in sediment that takes millions of years to form. And the consequences are not only physical. Some deep ocean fish collected from trench environments have been found to contain unusually high concentrations of toxic heavy metals, including arsenic, at levels that far exceed what is found in fish from shallower waters. The deep ocean concentrates certain pollutants in ways that the surface does not, and the animals that live there, already adapted to extremes, already living at the edge of what biology makes possible, carry those contaminants in their tissues. The Challenger Deep is the deepest place on Earth. It is also one of the most extreme, most remote, most alien environments on our planet. It was formed by the slow collision of tectonic plates over hundreds of millions of years. It shelters life that has adapted over deep evolutionary time to conditions of crushing pressure, permanent cold, and total darkness. It houses microbial communities of staggering diversity, most of which were entirely unknown to science until very recently. It contains the deepest fish ever recorded, organisms that have rewritten the textbooks on the limits of vertebrate survival, and single-celled creatures the size of saucers living quietly on the seafloor. And humanity has explored only the tiniest fraction of it. Every expedition, every descent, every sample, every frame of footage, returns with something new. Something unexpected. Something that shifts the picture a little further in a direction no one had fully anticipated. The Challenger Deep is more than a depth measurement on a map. It is a reminder that this planet is larger, stranger, and more alive than we have yet fully understood. That beneath the surface of the familiar world, there are still places where the rules are different, where life has found solutions we have not yet imagined, and where the story of Earth is still being written in the dark.